The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, their soft glow casting elegant shadows over the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. The scent of aged wine and expensive perfume floated in the air, mingling with the distant murmur of conversations dipped in polished arrogance. The guests moved in effortless synchronization, their every gesture rehearsed, their every smile measured. It was a world where appearances meant power, where wealth wasn't whispered. It was displayed. And then Sandra Bullock walked in. Her entrance was nothing like the others. No black limousine, no entourage, no sparkling jewels hanging from her neck like trophies. Just a simple, elegant grey dress, understated yet striking in its own way. She didn't need glittering diamonds to turn heads. Her presence did that effortlessly. But in a room where extravagance was a currency, her simplicity was a silent rebellion. Two women draped in shimmering gold gowns, their laughter as crisp as the champagne in their hands, exchanged a glance. Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James, the reigning queens of high society. They lived for moments like this, where a single raised eyebrow or a whispered remark could slice through someone's confidence like a blade. Vivian leaned in, her voice a silken whisper. "Oh, look at that. Did someone forget to tell her this isn't a coffee shop meetup?" Eleanor smirked, eyes glinting. How tragic. She must think humility is fashionable. Their quiet snickers went unnoticed by most, but Sandra felt it, the unspoken judgment, the weight of 1,000 scrutinizing eyes. She had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize when she was being sized up, but tonight she wasn't here for them. A waiter passed by, offering glasses of champagne on a silver tray. Sandra took one, unfazed, bringing the crystal rim to her lips with practiced grace. But just as she was about to take a sip, a voice cut through the hum of the room, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to be deniable. "Poor thing," Eleanor sighed dramatically, feigning concern. She must have wandered in by mistake. A flicker of amusement crossed Sandra's face, but she said nothing. She had dealt with people like this before, the kind who thrived on exclusion, who built their worth on making others feel small. She had learned long ago that the best response was no response at all, but Eleanor and Vivian weren't done. As Sandra moved further into the ballroom, guests parted with polite smiles, some offering quick greetings, others barely acknowledging her presence. It wasn't hostility, it was worse, it was dismissal, as if she were nothing more than an afterthought in a room full of significance. A few feet away, Eleanor took another delicate sip of champagne, her lips curling into a smirk. "She doesn't belong here," she murmured, "and by the end of the night she'll know it." Vivian chuckled, tilting her glass slightly in agreement. "Oh, she'll know." Sandra caught the movement from the corner of her eye, the way they watched her, like predators circling prey. But what neither of them knew was that she wasn't just another guest. And before the night was over, they would learn a lesson they'd never forget. Because Keanu Reeves was in this room, and they had no idea what was coming. The evening carried on with its elegant charade, flashing smiles, empty conversations, and champagne that flowed like liquid gold. A live orchestra played softly in the background, setting the stage for yet another grand display of wealth disguised as generosity. Sandra moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. She wasn't here to impress anyone, nor did she care to, but something was off. She could feel it. The way conversations shifted when she walked past, the way eyes trailed her, measuring, calculating. She was being watched. And then it happened. A waiter, dressed in an immaculate white uniform, approached her with hesitant steps. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Miss Bullock, I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a change in your seating arrangement." Sandra arched a brow. "A change?" The waiter nodded, his discomfort evident. "Yes, ma'am. Your seat has been reassigned." There was a moment of silence, a flicker of tension in the air. Sandra didn't need to ask why, she already knew. A glance across the room confirmed her suspicions. Eleanor and Vivian sat at the most prestigious table, laughing, sipping champagne, their eyes glinting with satisfaction. This was their doing. Sandra inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. This wasn't about a seat. It was about power, about control, a move designed to humiliate her, to make it clear that she wasn't one of them. But what they failed to realize was that she never wanted to be. She offered the waiter a soft smile. "Where would you like me to sit?" The man hesitated before gesturing towards the farthest end of the ballroom, a table on the outskirts, practically exile. Away from the elite, away from the spotlight. Sandra nodded, unfazed. She turned, making her way through the room, feeling the lingering stares, the whispers that followed her. But if they were expecting to see her falter, to witness even a hint of embarrassment, they would be sorely disappointed. Eleanor leaned closer to Vivian, a slow smirk spreading across her lips. "That should take care of our little problem." Vivian chuckled, clinking her glass against Eleanor's. "Oh, darling, this night is just getting started." But what neither of them knew, what neither of them could even begin to imagine, was that their carefully crafted game was about to take an unexpected turn. Because Keanu Reeves had just entered the building, and he had seen everything. Sandra sat at her new table, far from the center of the event, where the most influential guests mingled under the golden glow of chandeliers. The whispers around her had grown louder, masked behind delicate laughter and forced politeness. She could feel their eyes on her, not in admiration, but in judgment. It was the same game, the same tired attempt to push her aside. But what they didn't understand was that she didn't need their approval. She picked up her champagne glass, twirling it between her fingers, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian were enjoying the show, their smug glances confirming what she already knew. They thought they had won. A waiter discreetly placed a folded note beside her plate. Sandra hesitated before picking it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was precise, elegant. "Sandra, darling, I do hope you're enjoying the evening. If you ever need help finding a proper gown for next year's event, I know a few wonderful stylists who could assist. Kisses, Eleanor." Sandra's grip on the note tightened slightly. Not from anger, but from sheer amusement. It was almost laughable, the desperation behind their arrogance. They wanted her to react, to show even a flicker of humiliation, but she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she placed the note back down with a soft, knowing smile. She wasn't here to play their games, but something still didn't feel right. As the night carried on, Sandra became more aware of the way conversations shifted around her. People weren't just avoiding her, they were actively ignoring her. The social hierarchy of the event had been set, and she had been strategically placed outside of it. And then she caught something. A whisper. Just a name. Keanu Reeves. Sandra's heart stilled for a fraction of a second. She turned her head slightly, listening. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian were huddled close, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions laced with something more than amusement. There was excitement, anticipation. "Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight," Vivian murmured, her voice dripping with something dangerous. Eleanor chuckled softly, swirling the champagne in her glass. "I think Sandra will love it." A chill ran down Sandra's spine. Their tone. It wasn't admiration. It was something else, something calculated. Keanu was here, and they were planning something. Sandra straightened in her chair, her mind racing. Whatever they had planned, it wasn't going to be good. What she didn't know was that Keanu had already noticed everything, and he was about to change the game. The evening moved forward, but for Sandra, time felt like it had slowed. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, it was all just background noise now. Her mind kept circling back to that whispered conversation. Eleanor and Vivian were up to something, and Keanu was at the center of it. She scanned the room, searching for him. He wasn't on the main floor, not among the socialites basking in their own importance. But then, there. Near the far side of the ballroom, standing with quiet confidence, dressed in a sharp black suit, yet somehow managing to look effortlessly relaxed. Keanu Reeves. Sandra had known him for years. He wasn't the type to seek attention, nor did he care for the pretentiousness of these events. If he was here, it wasn't just to smile for cameras. He had a reason. and judging by the way his eyes briefly met hers across the room, he already knew what was happening. Sandra's lips curled slightly. Of course he knew. But before she could make a move, the host of the gala took the stage, microphone in hand. The chatter in the room softened as the spotlight shifted toward the center. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice rang out, smooth and commanding. "Thank you for being here tonight. As you all know, this event is dedicated to a cause that is very close to our hearts, giving hope and opportunities to those in need. And none of this would be possible without the generosity of our incredible supporters." A polite round of applause followed. Sandra kept her gaze on Keanu, but something in the air shifted. The energy in the room became charged, expectant. And now, it is my absolute honor to introduce a man who has not only been a long-time supporter of this cause, but someone who embodies generosity, kindness, and integrity in every sense of the word. Please welcome Keanu Reeves. The applause this time was thunderous. Guests rose to their feet, some cheering, some clapping with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for only the most respected figures in the room. Sandra watched as Keanu made his way to the stage, his stride calm, unhurried. But she didn't miss the way Eleanor and Vivian sat up straighter, their eyes gleaming with something sinister. They were waiting for something. Keanu reached the podium, his expression composed, his presence commanding without even trying. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the room with an easy smile. "Thank you," he said simply, waiting for the applause to die down. "It's an honor to be here tonight, supporting a cause that truly matters. But before we continue..." He paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to build suspense. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone very special." Sandra stilled. Keanu's gaze swept across the audience before landing directly on her. "Someone who has not only contributed immensely to this cause," he continued, "but has done so without seeking recognition, without demanding the spotlight. Someone whose generosity and compassion often go unnoticed, but not tonight." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Keanu's next word sent a ripple through the entire ballroom. "I'm talking about Sandra Bullock." The room fell silent for a beat, then erupted. Applause, murmurs, shifting glances. The very people who had dismissed her mere moments ago were now scrambling to react, clapping with newfound enthusiasm, as if suddenly realizing their mistake. Eleanor and Vivian's faces were frozen, their expressions unreadable. But Sandra didn't care about them anymore, because Keanu Reeves had just changed everything, and the night was far from over. The applause continued to roll across the ballroom like waves, but Sandra remained still. She wasn't the type to be easily caught off guard. But this was unexpected. She could feel dozens of eyes shifting toward her, the same people who had dismissed her earlier now looking at her with something different. Respect, recognition. But Sandra wasn't naive. It wasn't respect they truly felt, it was fear. Fear that they had miscalculated, that they had overlooked someone important. She met Keanu's gaze across the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes. Something deliberate. He wasn't just making a speech, he was making a statement. The host smiled widely, clearly riding the excitement in the room. "Sandra, if you would, we'd love for you to join us on stage." For a brief moment, she considered declining, giving Eleanor and Vivian the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. But then, she caught a glimpse of them from the corner of her eye. Eleanor's fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass, Vivian's lips slightly parted in shock. That was all the motivation she needed. Sandra stood, slow and controlled, allowing every second to stretch. Every movement, every step toward the stage was a quiet defiance, a reminder that she had never needed anyone's approval to belong. The murmurs grew as she made her way past the tables, as those who had ignored her before now nodded, some even offering quick words of admiration. The same people who had pretended she didn't exist were now scrambling to be on her side. She reached the stage, stepping up to stand beside Keanu, who handed her the microphone with a small, knowing smile. Sandra took a breath. She hadn't prepared a speech. She didn't need one. She turned toward the audience, her voice smooth, unshaken. "It's funny," she began, her eyes sweeping over the room, stopping just briefly on Eleanor and Vivian. "People often assume that giving means seeking recognition, that if someone isn't in the spotlight, they must not be important." A ripple of tension passed through the room. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. But the truth is, real generosity doesn't need validation, and real worth isn't measured by where you sit in a ballroom. Silence. A heavy, weighted silence. Then applause. Slow at first, then growing louder, stronger. And for the first time that evening, Sandra wasn't the one being watched. Eleanor and Vivian were. Sandra handed the microphone back to Keanu, who nodded approvingly before turning to the crowd. "And that," he said with a grin, "is why she's here tonight." The applause reached a new peak, but Sandra didn't look back. She had said what she needed to say. She had won. But the night wasn't over. Because as she stepped down from the stage, making her way back to her table, she caught something out of the corner of her eye. Eleanor leaning in toward Vivian, her expression no longer smug but something else. Something colder. And then, a whisper. "She thinks this is over," Eleanor murmured, her voice laced with quiet venom. "But she has no idea what's coming." Sandra didn't stop, didn't react, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not yet. The applause faded, but the tension in the room remained thick. Sandra returned to her seat, her posture effortless, her expression calm. She could still feel the weight of lingering stares, some filled with admiration, others with quiet resentment. At the far side of the room, Eleanor and Vivian sat rigid, their carefully curated smiles faltering at the edges. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. They had set the stage for Sandra's humiliation, not her triumph. And yet here she was, elevated in front of everyone by none other than Keanu Reeves himself. Vivian leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. "This is bad." Eleanor's fingers tapped lightly against her glass, her eyes fixed on Sandra. "No, darling," she murmured, her voice controlled but cold. "This is just unexpected." Vivian's lips thinned. Keanu practically handed her the spotlight. Eleanor's gaze darkened. "Then we take it back." A subtle nod between them, a quiet understanding. The game wasn't over. Sandra, unaware of their whispered plans, but fully aware of the way the energy had shifted, took a slow sip of her champagne. Across the room, Keanu had stepped down from the stage, seamlessly blending back into the crowd, but his presence lingered. He had reset the balance of the night with just a few words. A waiter approached Sandra's table again, this time with another note. No hesitation this time. She unfolded it with measured ease. "You handled that well, but be careful. They don't like losing. K." Her lips pressed together in amusement. Of course Keanu knew. He always did. But before she could process the note further, the host's voice rang out again, drawing the crowd's attention. And now, for the most anticipated moment of the evening, the grand auction. A polite murmur swept through the ballroom. This was the part where the wealthiest guests proved just how generous they were by outbidding each other in a silent battle of financial superiority. Eleanor and Vivian straightened, slipping seamlessly back into their poised social masks. Their turn had come. The first item was announced, an exclusive week-long stay in a private Mediterranean villa. The bidding started, hands rising effortlessly, numbers climbing. Eleanor lifted her paddle with practiced grace, throwing in an obscenely high bid without blinking. A ripple of approval followed. Vivian smirked, her fingers lightly tapping against the table. And just like that, we remind them who really runs this room. Sandra watched, silent, unreadable. She wasn't interested in their game, but she had a feeling they weren't done playing. Then, the next item was revealed. A one-of-a-kind art piece, hand-painted by an esteemed international artist. And Eleanor's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. "Oh," she murmured, just loud enough for Sandra to hear. "I think this would be perfect for Sandra." Vivian's smirk deepened. "How thoughtful of you." Sandra turned her head slightly, just in time to see Eleanor lift her paddle. "A gift for our dear Sandra Bullock," she announced, voice sweet as honey, but sharp as glass. The crowd reacted with mild amusement, some chuckling, others murmuring in approval. A generous gift, a gesture of kindness. That's what it would look like. But Sandra knew better. It was a calculated move, a staged act of generosity, designed to box her into a reaction. If she accepted, she'd look like a charity case. If she refused, she'd appear ungrateful. Either way, Eleanor won. Or so she thought. The host smiled. What a generous offer. But of course, Miss Bullock is free to accept or decline. The room waited. Eyes turned toward Sandra once again. She exhaled softly, setting down her champagne glass. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she lifted her own paddle. The room stilled. "Actually," Sandra said, her voice smooth, effortless, "I'll place my own bid." Eleanor's smile froze. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, passed through her eyes before she quickly masked it. The host nodded, pleasantly surprised. "Miss Bullock places her own bid. Any counteroffers?" For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. A miscalculation. She hadn't expected Sandra to flip the game so easily. If she bid again, it would seem petty, desperate. But if she didn't, then she'd lose control of the situation entirely. Sandra didn't wait for her to decide. She raised her paddle slightly higher. "Actually, let's make it double." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Eleanor's grip on her paddle tightened. And then, Keanu chuckled, a low, amused sound from across the room, just enough for Sandra to hear. She didn't need to look at him to know what it meant. Well played. The host clapped his hands together. "A remarkable bid. Miss Bullock, congratulations." Applause, genuine this time. The art piece was hers, but more importantly, the moment was hers. Sandra picked up her champagne again, taking a slow sip. Across the room, Eleanor sat motionless, lips pressed together. Vivian leaned in, murmuring something, but Eleanor didn't react, because for the second time that night, their plan had failed, and they hated losing. The applause settled, but the tension between Sandra and Eleanor hung in the air like an unsaid challenge. Eleanor sat stiffly, her carefully rehearsed poise struggling to mask her frustration. Vivian, still gripping her champagne glass, forced a smile, but Sandra could see it, the flicker of defeat behind her eyes. Sandra didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with quiet confidence. She had played their game, and she had won. Again. But she wasn't foolish enough to believe they would give up that easily. The auction continued, but the excitement had shifted. Sandra was no longer the outsider being ignored. She was now the unshakable presence in the room. Conversations turned toward her. Guests who had previously avoided eye contact now smiled in her direction. The same people who had once dismissed her were suddenly eager to be in her good graces. Keanu, standing near the back of the ballroom, had been watching everything unfold. He hadn't needed to intervene. Sandra had handled them effortlessly. But still, he knew Eleanor well enough to know she wasn't done. And he was right. A subtle movement. Eleanor whispered something to a waiter, her expression cold, calculated. Within moments, a quiet murmur spread among the staff, and suddenly, a new energy filled the room. Then, the host took the stage again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "as we near the end of our auction, we have one final surprise, a special last-minute donation." Sandra's brows lifted slightly. This wasn't on the schedule. Vivian smirked. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, reclaiming her composure. The host gestured toward the ballroom doors as they swung open. Two staff members entered, carrying a large, elegant display case. Inside was a breathtaking necklace, deep blue diamonds arranged in an intricate, almost regal design. Gasps rippled through the audience. "This," the host continued, "is the Royal Azure, a priceless piece with a history of elegance and prestige, and it has just been donated for auction tonight by the lovely Eleanor Cartwright." Polite applause followed, but Sandra instantly recognized the move. Eleanor's smile was soft, charming. "Oh, I do hope we can find it a home tonight. And of course," she added, turning her gaze toward Sandra, "I can't think of anyone more deserving than our dear Miss Bullock." A beat of silence. Then, just as before, Eleanor lifted her paddle. "A gift," she declared smoothly, "for Sandra." The room fell into a hush, watching, waiting. Sandra didn't move. She knew what this was. Eleanor wasn't offering a gift. She was setting a trap. The necklace was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a public statement, a symbol of status and wealth. If Sandra refused, it would make headlines. If she accepted, Eleanor would spin it into a story, graciously helping Sandra elevate her place in society. Either way, Eleanor won. Or so she thought. A slow, knowing smile touched Sandra's lips. Without hesitation, she lifted her paddle. "I appreciate the gesture," Sandra said, her voice smooth as silk. "But I'd rather bid for it myself." Eleanor's smile flickered, just for a second. Sandra glanced toward the host. "What's the starting price?" A murmur passed through the crowd. The host cleared his throat, adjusting his cue cards. Well, the Royal Azure is valued at over $3 million. But of course, all proceeds go to charity, so we'll begin the bidding at $2 million. Sandra nodded. Then, with a measured grace, she raised her paddle higher. $2.5 million. A stir spread through the guests. Whispers, impressed nods. Eleanor's grip on her paddle tightened. She had expected Sandra to refuse, to falter, but now she was being forced into a decision. She could either outbid Sandra, making herself seem desperate, or back down in front of everyone. Sandra met Eleanor's eyes, and in that moment she knew Eleanor had already lost. Still, the woman lifted her paddle, masking her irritation behind a perfect smile. $3 million. Sandra tilted her head slightly, considering. Then, $4 million. A collective gasp. Even Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. Eleanor hesitated. That number wasn't about money, it was about power, and Sandra had just taken all of it. For the first time that night, Eleanor lowered her paddle. The host, barely containing his surprise, cleared his throat. "Well then, $4 million going once, going twice." He glanced at Eleanor, giving her one last chance to fight back. "Nothing. Sold. To Miss Sandra Bullock." Applause erupted, genuine this time. Sandra leaned back, relaxed. Eleanor forced a smile, but her hands curled tightly in her lap. Vivian, watching the entire thing unfold, exhaled sharply. "We should have stopped after the first round." Eleanor didn't respond, because she had never lost before. And tonight, she had lost twice. Keanu took a sip of his drink, smirking slightly. He had always known Sandra could hold her own, but watching her completely dismantle Eleanor's control of the evening, that was something even he hadn't expected. The night was drawing to a close, but Sandra knew this wasn't over, not yet, because Eleanor wasn't the type to forget a loss, and whatever came next would be her most dangerous move yet. The final moments of the gala unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, but beneath the polished smiles and polite farewells, a storm was brewing. Eleanor sat motionless at her table, her champagne untouched, her expression frozen in a carefully crafted mask of composure. But Sandra knew the truth. Behind that poised exterior, rage simmered. The ballroom doors opened and guests began making their way out, offering Sandra newfound admiration as they passed. Some congratulated her on her impressive generosity, others simply nodded with polite respect. The same people who had dismissed her just hours ago were now eager to align themselves with her. Sandra had won, but she wasn't naive. Eleanor wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat, and as Sandra turned to leave, she heard it, a whisper, a low, deliberate murmur. "She may have the crowd now," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with quiet venom. "But by tomorrow she'll be nothing more than a foolish actress who didn't know her place." Sandra didn't stop, didn't react, but the meaning behind those words settled deep in her bones. This wasn't over. Keanu appeared beside her just as she reached the exit, his expression unreadable. He had seen this game played 100 times before in different rooms, different circles, different faces. But he had never seen someone handle it the way Sandra had. "They're not done," he said simply. Sandra exhaled, amused. "Of course not." Keanu studied her for a moment. "And?" She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "And they don't realize they've already lost." A slow grin tugged at the corner of Keanu's lips. "Good." The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, away from the heavy air of wealth and whispered power struggles. A valet pulled up with Sandra's car, still the same modest vehicle she had arrived in, while luxury cars lined the driveway, waiting for their owners. Sandra opened the door but hesitated for a second. Keanu was watching her, waiting. She smirked. "This should be fun." Keanu chuckled. "I'm looking forward to it." She slid into the driver's seat, closing the door with ease, the weight of the evening rolling off her shoulders. As she pulled away from the gala, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Eleanor and Vivian stood at the entrance, still smiling, still performing for the public. But Sandra knew the truth. This wasn't just about a gala. It wasn't just about wealth or reputation. It was about power. And Eleanor had just realized she wasn't the one holding it anymore. Sandra was. The night was over, but the game had only just begun.